His hand caught her wrist just as the conductor shouted those two words that could end everything. All aboard! Elise Hartwell stood frozen on the wooden platform of Blackstone Station. Her ticket to Boston gripped so tight in her other hand that the paper had gone damp with sweat. Her single leather suitcase sat at her feet like a loyal dog waiting for a command. The October wind came down off the Colorado mountains carrying the smell of pine and cold earth, and it whipped loose strands of hair across her face, but she did not move to brush them away. She could not move at all. The entire town seemed to be watching. Or maybe that was just how it felt when your life was collapsing in public. 6 months. She had survived 6 months in this place. She had crossed half the continent with a teaching certificate from Boston and a lie on her lips telling everyone she was a mail-order bride because that was the only way a woman alone could travel west without being harassed, questioned, or turned away at every stop. The truth was simpler and sadder. She was running. Running from a mother who believed a woman's highest calling was obedience. Running from Frederick Ashmore, the banker's son, with manicured hands and a smile that never reached his pale eyes, the man her family had chosen for her, without once asking what she wanted. Running from a life already written in someone else's handwriting. She had arrived in Blackstone, Colorado with $11 in savings, a head full of stubborn idealism, and the radical belief that she could build something of her own in a place where nobody knew her name. And for a while, impossibly, it had worked. The school board had hired her. Not eagerly, not warmly, but they needed a teacher, and she had credentials, and in a frontier town, credentials outweighed suspicion. She had stood in front of 23 children in a one-room schoolhouse and taught them reading and writing and arithmetic the way she believed they deserved to be taught. Equally, without exception, without apology. That was the beginning of the end. The school board met at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, and by 3:15, her career in Blackstone was over. She could still see their faces. 5 men in dark suits seated around a table in the cramped office above the mercantile staring at her like she had committed a crime instead of teaching long division. Councilman Porter, with his twitching mustache and his barely concealed satisfaction. Garrett Boone, the lumber mill owner, whose son Colton had called Fiona Calloway a filthy name in the schoolyard and been disciplined for it. The others nameless to her now blending together into a wall of self-righteous disapproval. "Your methods are unsuitable, Miss Hartwell," Porter had said. "I teach reading, writing, and mathematics," she had replied, keeping her voice level, even as her hands trembled against the fabric of her skirt. "The same curriculum you approved. You teach the Calloway children alongside everyone else. You let those Irish sit in the front row. You allow girls to study mathematics with boys. I teach children," Elise had said. "That is what you hired me to do." But they had not hired her to challenge the order of things. They had hired her to maintain it, to sort children into the categories Blackstone had already decided for them. Irish in the back, girls learning only what girls needed to learn, power flowing downhill from the families who own things to the families who own nothing. And Elise, with her Boston education and her inconvenient conscience, had refused. She had defended Fiona Calloway when Colton Boone called her a slur. She had told the entire class that in her schoolroom, every child deserved respect regardless of where their family came from. She had looked Colton in the eye and said those words knowing full well that his father owned the lumber mill, knowing that Garrett Boone sat on the school board, knowing what it would cost her. And it had cost her everything. "You embarrassed the Boone family in front of the entire town," Porter had said. "Garrett Boone owns the lumber mill," Elise had replied. "That makes him powerful. It does not make him right. And you, Miss Hartwell, are neither." The silence that followed had felt like drowning. She had gathered her things, a reading primer, a box of chalk, her teaching certificate rolled in its leather tube. She had walked out without another word, and by the time she reached the bottom of the stairs, she could hear them laughing. Now she stood on the platform with her suitcase and her ticket and the $11.40 that represented everything she had left in the world. Enough for the train east, maybe $2 left over after that. $2 and a return to the life she had fled, the life where women did as they were told and swallowed their opinions like bitter medicine. Her mother's last letter burned in her memory. "You have made your choice, Elise. Do not come crying back to us when the frontier chews you up." The conductor was climbing aboard. The whistle screamed. Steam billowed across the platform in white clouds that smelled of coal and iron. In 30 seconds, the train would pull away, and if she was not on it, She would be stranded in a town that had just made it violently clear she was not welcome. She bent to pick up her suitcase. That was when she felt it, a hand closing around her wrist. Not rough, not violent, but firm enough that she could not pull free without effort. "Don't get on that train." She turned. Caleb Wren stood 3 feet away, his hat in his other hand, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an expression she had never seen on any man before. Not ownership, not the calculating appraisal she had grown accustomed to from men who saw women as property to be evaluated. Not pity either, which would have been worse. What she saw in his face was something raw and unguarded and desperate, the look of a man who had been working up the courage to speak and had nearly run out of time. "Just give me one chance," he said. Elise stared at him. She knew him, but barely. A mountain man who lived somewhere north of Blackstone on property that bordered the high timber country. She had seen him in town occasionally, always separate from the other cowboys who blew their wages on whiskey and cards. He moved differently than they did. Quietly, deliberately. Like a man who had learned to navigate the world without making unnecessary noise. They had danced once, at the autumn social at the church, when Elise had been introduced to half the territory and promptly forgotten by most of it. He had asked her to dance with a formality that seemed almost painful, and she had said yes, because he was the only man in the room who had asked without leering first. He had been surprisingly graceful for someone who spent his days on horseback and his nights in the mountains, and when the music ended, he had thanked her and walked away without trying to press his advantage. She had thought about that dance more often than she cared to admit. But that did not explain this. That did not explain why he was standing on a train platform, gripping her wrist, asking for something she did not understand. "Mr. Wren," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, trying to sound like a woman who had everything under control instead of a woman whose life had just shattered. "I heard what happened," he said. He turned his hat in his hands, and she noticed for the first time how large those hands were, scarred across the knuckles, the hands of someone who worked with them every day. "With the school board, I am sorry." "Do not be. It is done. It is not right." "A great many things are not right, Mr. Wren. That does not change them." He looked at her for a long moment, and Elise had the deeply unsettling feeling that he could see straight through her practiced composure to the raw fear underneath. The fear she had been holding at bay since she walked out of that office. The fear of having nowhere to go and no one to turn to and nothing left except a ticket back to a cage she had already escaped once. "You are leaving," he said. It was not a question. "Tomorrow morning." She glanced at the train. "This morning, apparently." "Going back to Boston. I do not have anywhere else to go. You could stay here." The words were quiet, but they hit Elise like a physical blow. She actually took a step backward, pulling her wrist free from his grip. "Stay here," she repeated. "The town just made it very clear they do not want me. The school board does not speak for everyone. They speak for everyone who matters. They do not speak for me." Something dangerous flickered to life in Elise's chest. Something that felt terrifyingly close to hope. She crushed it immediately, the way you stamp out a spark before it catches. "I appreciate the sentiment, Mr. Wren, but I cannot stay in Blackstone without employment. No one is going to hire the troublesome teacher who embarrassed the school board. There is other work. Like what? Cooking, cleaning, taking in laundry." The bitterness in her voice surprised her. "I did not come west to scrub floors." "I know." His voice was gentle in a way that made her throat tighten. "You came to teach, and you are good at it." "How would you know that?" "I watched you with the students after church one Sunday. The way the Callaway girl looks at you like you hung the moon. The way young Tommy Patterson finally learned to read because you sat with him every day after school, even though his father never paid you a cent extra for it." He paused. "People notice these things, Miss Hartwell, even if the school board does not." Elise felt her eyes sting. She blinked hard. She would not cry. Not here, not in front of him, not in front of the town that had discarded her. "It does not matter anymore," she said. "It matters to me." "Why?" The question came out sharper than she intended, but Caleb did not flinch. He stood there, turning his hat in his hands, and said, "Because I have spent my whole life watching good people get ground down by bad ones, and I am tired of staying silent while it happens." "Then speak up at the next town meeting. Tell them they are wrong, but I will be on a train by then, so it will not help me much." She regretted the words the moment they left her mouth. He did not deserve her anger. He had done nothing but show up and ask for something she did not know how to give. But he absorbed it without complaint, just stood there with that steady, patient expression that made her feel both safe and terrified at the same time. "What if you had a reason to stay?" he asked finally. What reason could possibly be enough? Me. The single word stopped Elise cold. The platform seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Behind her, the train whistle screamed again, and the wheels began to grind against the rails. The last call, the final chance to board. You, she repeated slowly. I know we barely know each other. I know I am just a mountain man with more ambition than sense. But I am asking you to give me a chance. Give this a chance. Do not get on that train. Stay in Blackstone. Let me court you properly like a gentleman. And if after a few months you still want to leave, I will buy your ticket myself and wish you well. Elise stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was certain he could hear it. You cannot be serious. I have never been more serious about anything in my life. You do not even know me. I know enough. I know you are brave. I know you are smart. I know you stood up for what is right even when it cost you everything. That is more than most people manage in a whole lifetime. That is not enough to build a life on. Maybe not, but it is a place to start. The train was moving now. Slowly at first, the great iron wheels groaning, the couplings clanking one by one down the length of the cars. Steam rolled across the platform. The conductor leaned out from the last car and looked at Elise with a question on his face. She had maybe 10 seconds to run for it. 10 seconds to grab her suitcase and throw herself aboard and leave Blackstone and Caleb Wren and everything else behind forever. She did not move. The train pulled away. The sound of it faded into the distance, swallowed by the mountains, until all that remained was the wind and the silence, and two people standing on an empty platform. If I stay, Elise said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, it would not be because you asked. It would be on my terms. Something like relief broke across Caleb's face. Whatever terms you want. I find my own work. I do not depend on you or anyone else for my survival. Agreed. If I change my mind, if I decide this was a mistake, you let me go. No arguments, no guilt, no trying to convince me otherwise. Agreed. And we do this properly. No expectations, no assumptions. You court me like a gentleman and we see where it leads. But I make no promises. I would not want you to. Elise took a shaky breath. The enormity of what she had just done settled over her like a heavy coat. She had let the train leave. She had chosen the uncertain future over the safe past. She had trusted a man she barely knew, not because she was foolish, but because something in his eyes told her he was telling the truth. And because underneath all the fear and the anger and the exhaustion, she was not ready to surrender. Then I suppose I need to ask the station master for a refund, she said. The smile that broke across Caleb's face was like sunrise over the Rockies, slow and warm and impossible to look away from. Thank you, he had said quietly. Do not thank me yet. I might still ruin your life. I will take that risk. That night, Elise lay awake in her boarding house room, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind howl down from the mountains. Mrs. Henderson, the landlady, had agreed to let her stay another week on the condition that rent was paid by Friday. After that, Elise would need to find work or find somewhere else to sleep. She had $11.40 plus the refunded ticket money. Enough for a few weeks if she was careful. Not enough for a future. Morning came cold and bright. October in Colorado had a sharpness to it that Boston never managed the air thin and cleaned the sky so blue it looked painted. Elise dressed carefully, pinned her hair, and went downstairs to find Caleb Wren sitting in the boarding house parlor, looking slightly nervous. I was not sure you would actually stay, he admitted. Neither was I. Do you regret it? Ask me in a week. He smiled. Fair enough. I thought maybe we could start with breakfast. There is a cafe down the street. I cannot afford cafe breakfast, Mr. Wren. Caleb, please, and it is my treat. That violates our agreement. I do not depend on you. It is breakfast, not a mortgage. Can we call it friendly hospitality? Elise felt herself smile despite everything. I suppose that is acceptable. They walked to the cafe together, and Elise felt every eye in Blackstone following them. She could practically hear the whispers already. The disgraced teacher and the mountain man. How predictable. How pathetic. But when they sat down and Caleb asked about her teaching methods, genuinely asked like he wanted to understand why she had structured her lessons the way she had, Elise found herself talking. Really talking. For the first time since arriving in Blackstone, someone wanted to hear what she actually thought instead of telling her what to think. I wanted them to see each other as equals, she explained. Not as boys and girls, not as Irish children and everybody else, just as students learning together. Makes sense to me, Caleb said. The school board called it radical. The school board thinks anything invented after 1850 is radical. She laughed, and it felt like something cracking open inside her chest, not breaking, opening. They talked through breakfast and into the late morning. And somewhere between the eggs and the third cup of coffee, Caleb told her something that changed how she saw him entirely. He was not a hired hand. He was not a drifter, scraping by on seasonal work. His father had died 2 years ago, leaving him 4,000 acres of mountain land and a pile of debt that would have crushed most men. Caleb had worked himself nearly to death, paying it off alone in the high country through 2 brutal Colorado winters. And now the debt was gone, and he was building something on that land, something that sounded impossible. "I want to create a place where people are treated fairly," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "Ranch hands who work for me get decent wages and days off. Families can build homes on my land if they want, regardless of where they came from. Nobody gets pushed around because of their name or their accent or the church they attend." "That sounds expensive," Elise said carefully. "It is, but some things are worth the cost." She studied his face across the table and saw something that both attracted and frightened her. The same stubborn idealism that had gotten her fired. The same refusal to accept that the world had to be ugly just because powerful people wanted it that way. It should have made her cautious. Instead, it made her feel less alone. "I need to find work," she said abruptly. "Real work, not charity. Do you have any suggestions?" Caleb considered. "Most places will not hire you, not after what happened with the school board. But there is someone who might not care about any of that." "Who?" "Grandma Bridget Calloway, Fiona's grandmother. She runs a laundry with her daughter Maeve on the east side of town. They are always short on help." Elise remembered Fiona. Quiet, brilliant Fiona who sat in the front row and absorbed every lesson like she was starving for knowledge. The girl whose defense had cost Elise her position. "Will she even speak to me?" Elise asked. "After what happened?" "Only one way to find out." They walked to the east side of Blackstone, the Irish section, a collection of small, weathered buildings that most of the town pretended did not exist. It occupied a narrow strip of land between the creek and the railroad tracks, the kind of location that flooded every spring and baked every summer, the kind of place people ended up when they had no power to end up anywhere better. The laundry sat in a narrow storefront with steam rising from the windows. The smell of lye soap hit Elise before they even reached the door sharp enough to make her eyes water. Grandma Bridget Calloway answered Caleb's knock. She was small and white-haired, with hands roughened by decades of work and eyes that seemed to see straight through everything, including Elise's carefully maintained composure. There was nothing soft about her. She had the look of a woman who had survived things that would have killed someone less stubborn. "Mr. Wren," she said, her voice carrying the faint music of Ireland beneath the hard consonants she had learned in America. "What brings you to my door?" "Mrs. Calloway, this is Miss Hartwell." "I know who she is." Bridget turned those piercing eyes on Elise. "You taught my granddaughter." "Yes, ma'am, until yesterday." "I heard what happened. You spoke up for Fiona, lost your position because of it." Elise braced herself. "I am sorry if I caused any trouble for your family. Do not apologize for doing what is right. There is little enough of that in this world." Bridget studied her for a long moment, the kind of measuring look that made Elise feel like she was being weighed on some invisible scale. "Why are you here, Miss Hartwell?" "I need work. Caleb suggested you might need help." "I need help every day, but most people will not work here. They think it is beneath them." "I do not care what people think." "You should care a little. It makes life easier." "I tried making life easier. It did not suit me." Something flickered across Bridget's face. Something that might have been approval, or might have been recognition of a kindred stubbornness. "The work is hard. Your hands will crack and bleed. The steam burns. You will smell like soap and sweat from dawn to dark." "When do I start?" Bridget smiled. A real smile, warm and unexpected, that transformed her weathered face into something almost beautiful. "Tomorrow morning, 5 o'clock. Do not be late." "Thank you. Thank you so much." "Do not thank me yet. First week is trial. If you cannot keep up, you are gone." "I will keep up." Walking back toward the boarding house, Elise felt something she had not experienced in months. Hope. Not the wild, desperate kind that she had crushed on the train platform, but something steadier. Hope mixed with purpose. "Thank you," she said to Caleb. "I did not do anything." "You did everything." He looked at her, and Elise saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. But he just tipped his hat and said, "I will see you tomorrow evening if you are not too tired." "I will make time." 5 o'clock came faster than she expected. She arrived at the laundry in darkness, her hands already cold despite the October air. Bridget was waiting inside, steam rising from the enormous washing tubs in the back room, the fire already roaring under the copper boilers. "You are on time," Bridget said. "That is more than most manage." Elisa's first day lasted 14 hours. She learned to sort laundry by fabric and soil level, to regulate the temperature of the wash water by feel to wring sheets with a rhythm that saved her shoulders from giving out by noon. Her arms burned from lifting wet fabric that seemed to weigh as much as she did. Her hands cracked from the lye soap within the first 2 hours. The steam turned the back room into something that felt like the inside of a furnace, and breathing became an act of will rather than instinct. By midday, she had scalded her left wrist badly enough that Bridget had to wrap it in clean cloth. "You can leave," Bridget said. "No shame in admitting this is not for you." Elise plunged another load of linens into the scalding water. "I am not leaving." By week's end, she had learned the rhythm. Wash, wring, hang, press, fold, deliver. Maeve Calloway, Bridget's daughter, worked beside her without speaking much. Maeve was 35, a widow whose husband had died 3 years ago, under circumstances no one discussed in detail. She had the careful movements of a woman who had learned to be invisible and the sharp eyes of one who missed nothing. Elise caught Maeve watching her several times with something that might have been respect. On Saturday evening, Caleb came to walk her back to the boarding house. Elise's hair hung limp with sweat, her dress soaked through her hands, raw and cracked in places that made every movement painful. "You look terrible," Caleb said. "Thank you. That is exactly what every woman wants to hear." "I mean, you look exhausted. Are you sure about this?" "Do not finish that sentence." They walked in silence for a moment. Then Caleb said quietly, "You do not have to prove anything to me." "I am not proving anything to you. I am proving it to myself." He nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But maybe let me buy you dinner. You look like you have not eaten today." Her stomach growled, betraying her. "Fine," she said, "but I am paying you back next week. We will argue about that later." Over stew and bread at the cafe, Elise finally allowed herself to relax. Her entire body ached, but it was honest pain. The kind that came from working, not from being dismissed or diminished. "Bridget says I can stay on," she told Caleb. "Permanent position if I want it." "That is good news. It is brutal work, but it is mine." "You sound almost happy about it." Elise considered the word. "I think I am. For the first time since I left Boston, I am doing something that actually matters. Those clothes I am washing belong to miners who need them clean for Sunday church. Ranch wives who do not have time to do it themselves. Bridget serves people the rest of this town ignores. And now I am part of that. The school board does not know what they gave up. The school board will never admit they made a mistake. Probably not. But mistakes have consequences whether people admit them or not. 3 weeks into her new position, Elise started seeing what others had missed. Bridget's laundry ran smoothly, but it was small. Confined to the Irish section of town and a handful of customers willing to cross the invisible boundary that separated respectable Blackstone from the people it pretended did not exist. "Why do you not offer service to the mining camps?" Elise asked one morning while folding sheets. Bridget looked up sharply. "Mining camps? There are 3 within 10 miles of Blackstone. Those men need laundry service desperately, and from what I have heard, they are paying outrageous prices for someone to ride out once a week and collect their clothes. They will not do business with an Irish laundry. They will if we do not advertise it as an Irish laundry." Elise set down the sheet she was folding. "We call it Blackstone Laundry Service. Fast, affordable, reliable. The work is the same, the quality is the same. We are simply making it easier for people who are too prejudiced to see past their own ignorance." Maeve stopped working. "You would do that, pretend we are not who we are." "I am not pretending anything," Elise said firmly. "I am expanding your customer base. The quality speaks for itself." Bridget's eyes narrowed. "You have experience with this kind of strategy." "My father ran a textile business in Boston. I watched him convince wealthy women to buy ordinary fabric by telling them it was French silk. If he could bend the truth for profit, I can bend it for survival." A slow smile spread across Bridget's face. "I like the way you think, Miss Hartwell." Within 2 weeks, Elise had organized a delivery route to all 3 mining camps. She printed flyers on cheap paper and convinced Caleb to distribute them when he sold cattle to the camps. The miners responded immediately. Orders tripled in the first week, then quadrupled. Bridget hired 2 more workers. Maeve started smiling, something her mother said she had not done since her husband died. And Elise discovered she had a talent for business that her teaching certificate had never revealed. Numbers made sense to her: routes, logistics, pricing structures, customer relationships. It was like teaching in a way. Understanding what people needed and finding the most efficient way to deliver it. But success, Elise was learning, had a price. And in Blackstone, Colorado, that price was measured in the attention of men who believed they controlled everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October when the door of the laundry opened without a knock, and a man stepped inside who changed everything. Judge Harlan Creed was 55 years old, tall, impeccably dressed in a dark suit that probably cost more than Bridget's entire building. He had silver hair swept back from a high forehead and a face that might have been handsome once before it hardened into something else entirely. Something carved from granite and ambition. He carried himself with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He owned the largest silver mine in the territory. He controlled the town council through a web of favors and debts. He held the position of circuit judge, which meant he was simultaneously the law and the man who profited most from bending it. In Blackstone, Harlan Creed did not merely have power, he was power. Elise set down the shirt she had been pressing. The steam from the irons made the air between them shimmer. "Miss Hartwell," Creed said, looking around the cramped, steamy workspace with an expression that was not quite disgust and not quite amusement. Something in between. The expression of a man surveying territory he considered beneath him, but potentially useful. "I have heard interesting things about you." "Judge Creed, to what do we owe this visit?" "Just wanted to meet the woman who has been causing such a stir." He stepped further inside his polished boots, looking absurd against the water-stained floorboards. "Dismissed from teaching, now running laundry routes to my mining camps. Quite the trajectory. Honest work is honest work." "Indeed." His smile did not move past his lips. "Though I have to wonder, does Mrs. Calloway understand just how ambitious her new employee truly is? I am helping to grow a business. Everyone benefits. Of course, I am sure your intentions are entirely pure." There was a pause. The steam hissed. Somewhere in the back room, a copper boiler clanked against its frame. Then Creed did something Elise did not expect. He pulled a wooden stool from the corner, dusted it off with his handkerchief, and sat down. Like he intended to stay. Like what he had to say next required sitting. "I want to tell you something about myself, Miss Hartwell," he said. His voice changed, lost its edge, became almost conversational, almost human. "When I was 7 years old, I lived on the streets of this town. No father, no mother, no one who looked down at me without spitting first. I ate what I could steal. I slept in alleys. In winter, I crawled under the church steps and prayed I would not freeze before morning." Elise said nothing. She had not expected this. "Nobody helped me," Creed continued. "Nobody offered me a hand or a meal or a reason to believe that my life would ever be anything other than misery. So I helped myself. I worked the mines when I was 12, saved every cent, taught myself to read with stolen books, studied law by candlelight in a room the size of a coffin. And when I finally had enough money and enough knowledge, I started building." He gestured broadly, taking in the town beyond the laundry walls. "Every building on Main Street exists because I made it possible. Every family that has food on the table, every child who goes to school, every miner who earns a wage, does so because I created the conditions for it. I brought order to a place that had none. I took chaos and turned it into something that functions." He stood. The conversational tone vanished, replaced by something harder. Something that sounded like a warning wrapped in silk. "You call that oppression, Miss Hartwell? You look at the way this town operates and you see injustice. But I have been where injustice lives. I slept in its gutters and ate from its garbage. And I built this." He spread his hands. "Not for myself, for every child who would have ended up like me if someone had not imposed order on the chaos." He moved toward the door, then stopped and looked back at her. "You are a smart woman, braver than most. But you are dismantling something you do not understand. And when it falls apart, it will not be you who suffers. It will be the people who can least afford it." Then he was gone. The door closed behind him with a quiet click. Elise stood motionless in the steam, her heart pounding. Bridget emerged from the back room. The old woman's face was tight. "You heard all of that?" Elise asked. "Every word. He did not threaten me, not directly. That is what makes him dangerous," Bridget said quietly. "A man who threatens you can fight. A man who believes he is saving the world while he crushes it under his heel." She shook her head. "That is the kind of enemy who never stops. Because in his mind, he is the hero." That night, Elise could not sleep. She lay in her boarding house bed and turned Creed's words over in her mind, examining them from every angle. And the terrible, uncomfortable truth was that she could not dismiss them entirely. He had been an orphan, he had built himself from nothing. He believed genuinely and completely that his control over Blackstone was a form of protection, not tyranny. He was wrong. She was certain of that. You did not protect people by deciding for them or remember them. You did not create order by crushing anyone who challenged it. But the fact that his conviction was sincere made him infinitely more frightening than a simple bully. A bully could be exposed. A man on a righteous mission could never be convinced he was the villain. She got out of bed and stood by the window looking out at the dark mountains. Somewhere up there, Caleb was sleeping in the house his father had built. Somewhere below, Bridget and Maeve and little Fiona were huddled in their cramped home behind the laundry, the smell of lye soap seeping through the walls. And somewhere in a fine house on the hill, Judge Harlan Creed was making plans. Elise pressed her forehead against the cold glass. She had let the train leave without her. She had chosen this place, and these people, in this fight. And now, standing in the darkness with cracked hands and an uncertain future, she realized something that settled into her bones like winter frost. She was not going to run. Not from the school board. Not from Garrett Boone. Not from Harlan Creed. Blackstone had rejected her, but Elise Hartwell was not done fighting yet. Below her window, the town lay quiet under the October stars. But the quiet was deceptive. Like the stillness before a Colorado thunderstorm, it promised nothing except that what came next would be violent. And at the silver mine on the edge of town, a lamp burned late in Judge Creedy's private office. He sat behind his mahogany desk reading a ledger, tapping one finger slowly against the wood. He had given the Hartwell woman a chance to understand, a chance to see what she was threatening. Most people confronted with the weight of his story and the reality of his power backed down, found reasons to be reasonable, learned to live inside the order he had built. But she had stood there in that steaming laundry with raw hands and a straight spine, and had not flinched, had not agreed, had not looked away. Creedy closed the ledger and leaned back in his chair. "Interesting," he said to the empty room. Then he pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him and began to write. The first contract disappeared on a Monday. Elise arrived at the laundry before dawn, as she always did, her breath making clouds in the November air, her cracked hands already stinging from the cold. She found Bridget standing at the front counter with a piece of paper in her hand and a look on her face that Elise had never seen before. Not anger, something worse. The look of a woman who had been expecting a blow and had finally received it. "Camp Ridgeline canceled," Bridget said. "Effective immediately. The supervisor sent word last night, said they have been instructed to use a different service." Instructed by whom? Bridget did not answer. She did not need to. By Wednesday, the second contract was gone. Camp Silverton, the largest of the 3 mining operations, sent a rider with a terse note. Services no longer required. No explanation. No apology. Just the blunt finality of a door slamming shut. Elise stood in the back room, surrounded by steam and the smell of lye soap, and felt the walls closing in. 2 contracts gone in 3 days. That was not coincidence. That was not the natural movement of commerce. That was Harlan Creed reaching out from his office on the hill and squeezing until something broke. "He is trying to starve us out," Elise said. Bridget wrung a sheet with hands that had been doing this work for 30 years. "He is succeeding." "Not yet. We still have Camp Hollow Creek. We still have the town customers. We still have the ranch families. For how long? If Creedy wants them gone, they will be gone. Then we replace them. We find new customers. We work harder, charge less, deliver faster. We make ourselves so essential that cutting us off would hurt him more than it hurts us." Maeve looked up from the pressing table. "That means working twice as many hours for half the profit." "I know what it means." "Do you?" Maeve's voice was quiet but sharp. "Because my daughter needs me to come home at night. My mother is 65 years old and should not be lifting copper boilers at midnight. This is not just about winning a fight, Elise. This is about whether we survive it." The words stung because they were true. Elise had been so focused on not surrendering that she had forgotten to count the cost for the people standing beside her. But she could not stop. Stopping meant Creedy won. Stopping meant every small-minded man who had ever looked at her and seen something to be controlled instead of someone to be reckoned with was right. And Elise Hartwell would rather work herself into the ground than give them that satisfaction. 2 weeks, she said. "Give me 2 weeks. If we are not back on our feet by then, I will find another way." Bridget and Maeve exchanged a look, the kind of look that passes between women who have survived enough to know when someone is making a promise they might not be able to keep. 2 weeks, Bridget said. Elise threw herself into the work with a fury that frightened even her. She rose at 4 in the morning and did not stop until well past midnight. She personally rode the delivery routes, cutting travel time by finding shortcuts through the mountain trails that Caleb had shown her. She printed new flyers and distributed them to every homestead within 20 miles. She undercut every competitor's price until choosing anyone other than Blackstone Laundry Service made no financial sense whatsoever. And it worked, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. Ranch families who had never considered using a laundry service started bringing their clothes in. Railroad workers passing through Blackstone heard about the quality and the prices and told other railroad workers down the line. Even some of Creede's own mine employees, the ones who lived in town rather than the camps, started sneaking their laundry to Bridget's operation because the work was simply better than anyone else's. Business did not just recover, it exploded. But the cost was written on Elise's body. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. Her hands bled constantly, the cracks in her skin reopening every time she plunged them into hot water. Dark circles formed under her eyes. Her shoulders ached with a deep, permanent pain that no amount of rest could touch, though she was not resting anyway. Caleb watched it happen with growing alarm. "You are going to collapse," he said one evening, meeting her outside the laundry as she swayed on her feet. It was late November now, the air bitter with approaching winter. Snow dusted the peaks above Blackstone. Elise's dress hung looser on her frame than it had a month ago. "I am fine." "You are not fine. You are burning yourself out, and when you fall, you will take everyone down with you because they are depending on you to hold us together. Better I burn out than let Creed burn us down." Caleb stepped closer. In the lamplight from the laundry window, his face was drawn with worry. He reached out and took her hands, gently turning them palm up. They were raw and split open in places, the skin around the cracks an angry red that spoke of infection held barely at bay. "These hands," he said quietly, "you are destroying them. They will heal. Not if you never let them." "Caleb," she pulled her hands back. "I cannot stop now. The moment I show weakness, he wins. This town gets to believe that powerful men always crush people like me, that trying to build something better is pointless. I will not let that happen. And I will not let you kill yourself to prove a point." They stood there in the cold, two stubborn people staring at each other across a distance that felt much wider than the 3 feet of frozen air between them. "I am not trying to prove a point," Elise said finally. "I am trying to survive." "Then let me help you survive. That is all I have ever wanted." She did not answer. She walked past him toward the boarding house, and he fell into step beside her, because that was what Caleb Wren did. He showed up. He walked beside her. He did not push, did not demand, did not try to take control. He simply refused to let her face the darkness alone. It was Garrett Boone who cracked the fragile peace. He appeared at the laundry on a Thursday afternoon, his expensive coat dusted with sawdust from the lumber mill, his face twisted into something between outrage and satisfaction. The kind of expression worn by a man who has been waiting for an excuse to attack and has finally found one. "My wife tried to hire your service last week," Boone said, pointing a thick finger at Elise. "Do you know what happened? Your Mrs. Calloway told her you were too busy to take new clients. Too busy. But somehow you found time for the Patterson family and the Hendricksons, every family whose children you taught, every family who did not call for your dismissal." Elise set down the iron she had been using. "Mrs. Calloway decides which clients to accept. I do not control the schedule." "You absolutely control it. Everyone in this town knows you are running that old woman's business now, and you are using it as a weapon, punishing families who did not support you, rewarding the ones who did. It is petty and vindictive, and I will not stand for it." The accusation hung in the steamy air, and the terrible thing, the thing that made Elise's stomach twist, was that she could not entirely deny it. She had suggested prioritizing certain families. She had made sure that people who had shown her kindness received better service than those who had called for her dismissal. She had told herself it was about efficiency, about loyalty, about rewarding customers who stuck with them during the contract losses. But Boone had just named it for what it was: revenge. "Get out of this laundry," Elise said quietly. "Not until you agree to stop playing games with people's livelihoods." "I am running a business, Mr. Boone. If your wife wants laundry service, she is welcome to wait her turn like everyone else. You are playing God with a washboard, Miss Hartwell. And when I tell Judge Creed exactly how you have been operating, he will take a very personal interest in shutting you down. As opposed to the personal interest he has already taken." Boone's face went a deeper shade of red. You have no idea who you are dealing with. He left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glass in the windows. Elise stood motionless in the silence that followed. Her hands were trembling, and not from the cold. Bridget appeared in the doorway to the back room. The old woman's face was unreadable. "He is not entirely wrong," Bridget said. The words landed like a slap. "What?" "You know what I mean, child. I agreed to your prioritizing because it seemed like good business sense. But we both know there was more to it than that. I was protecting the people who stood by us. You were punishing the ones who did not. There is a difference, and you are smart enough to see it." Bridget crossed her arms. "I have lived long enough to know what revenge looks like, even when it wears a business suit. If you want to fight Creed, fight him clean. The moment you start playing his game using power to hurt people who crossed you, you become him. And you are better than that." Elise wanted to argue. She wanted to defend herself with logic and justification and all the reasonable explanations she had constructed in her own mind. But standing in front of this woman who had survived famine and exile and decades of prejudice, she could not make the words come out. Because Bridget was right. "I will fix it," Elise said. "Equal service for everyone, no exceptions." Bridget nodded. "Good, now, get back to work. These sheets will not fold themselves." That evening, Elise sat on the boarding house porch with Caleb. The November sky was thick with stars, and the air carried the first real bite of winter. She told him about Boone's visit, about Bridget's words, about the uncomfortable realization that she had been sliding towards something ugly without noticing. "You caught it," Caleb said. "That is what matters." "I almost did not." "Almost does not count. You saw it and you corrected it. That takes more courage than never making the mistake in the first place." Elise pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Caleb, I need to tell you something." "All right. I am afraid, not of Creed, not of Boone. I am afraid of myself, of what I might become if I keep fighting this hard without anyone to tell me when I am crossing a line." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that changed everything. "I need to tell you something too." His voice had shifted, lost its usual steadiness, become something raw and exposed, like a man pulling back a curtain he has kept closed for years. "About what I am building at the ranch. It is bigger than I let on. My father did not leave me a modest spread with debt. He left me 4,000 acres in a breeding operation that supplies half the ranches in Colorado. I have been building it for 2 years, and it is finally turning real profit." Elise stared at him. "Why did you not tell me this before?" "Because most women hear wealthy rancher and start seeing dollar signs instead of the person. I wanted you to know me first, the man, not the property. I am not most women. I know. That is why I am telling you now." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes intense in the lamplight. "I am buying land from families who are about to lose it to the railroad. I am offering work to people who cannot get hired anywhere else. I am building a place where folks are judged by their character, not their last name or which church they sit in on Sunday. That makes powerful people nervous. People like Creed. And you are telling me this because associating with you makes me an even larger target. I am telling you because we are fighting the same fight, and we are stronger together than apart." Elise's throat tightened. "Is this still about courting me, or is this about building an alliance?" "It is about both." His voice dropped. "I will not lie to you, Elise. I need someone who understands what I am trying to do. Someone smart enough to help me do it right. But more than that, I want you. Not as an ally or a business partner. As the person I wake up thinking about and fall asleep remembering. And if that is too much too fast, tell me now, because I am already in too deep to pretend otherwise." The world seemed to stop. The stars held still. The wind died. Even the eternal creaking of the boarding house timbers went silent, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Elise had spent her entire life being told what she should want: security, respectability, a quiet existence as someone's wife and someone else's mother. No man had ever looked at her the way Caleb was looking at her now, like she was both the answer to a question and the question itself. "I do not know what to say," she whispered. "Say you will keep giving me chances. That is all I am asking." She kissed him. It was not planned or proper or anything her Boston upbringing would have approved of. But sitting on that drafty porch with her hands raw from work and her future uncertain and her heart so full it hurt, Elise kissed Caleb Wren like he was the only solid thing in a world that would not stop shifting. When they broke apart, he was smiling. That wide, unguarded grin she had first seen on the train platform, the one that made the mountains look ordinary by comparison. "Does this mean you are giving me another chance?" he asked. "It means I am tired of pretending I do not want this." "Good, because I am tired of being patient." They talked until past midnight about his plans for the ranch, her ideas for the laundry, the kind of community they both wanted to build, in a territory that seemed determined to crush anyone with vision. And when Caleb finally left, tipping his hat at the door with a tenderness that made her chest ache, Elise climbed the stairs to her room and lay awake in the darkness, not wondering if she had made a mistake, but imagining a future that did not involve surrendering. She was falling in love with a mountain man who believed the world could be better than it was. And for the first time in her 23 years, she was not afraid of what that meant. It was mid-December when the sky turned red. Elise was making a late delivery to the Patterson Ranch, 20 miles north of Blackstone. The December air was sharp enough to cut, and her horse's breath made thick clouds as they climbed the trail. She had spent the day filling orders, pressing shirts, loading the wagon. Her back ached, her hands ached. Everything ached. But the Pattersons were good people who paid on time and treated her with respect, and she would not let them down. She was 2 miles from town on the return trip when she smelled smoke. Not wood smoke, not the normal smell of chimneys and cooking fires that hung over every frontier town in winter. This was something else, something thick and chemical and wrong. She urged her horse faster. The road crested a low ridge, and from the top she could see Blackstone laid out below her in the valley, its buildings dark against the snow. And in the center of town, flames. Great orange tongues of fire reaching toward the sky, throwing sparks that drifted like terrible stars against the blackness. The schoolhouse was burning. Elise did not remember the ride down. One moment she was staring from the ridge. The next she was dismounting in front of a crowd gathered in the street, her lungs burning from the cold air and the smoke that hung over everything like a shroud. The roof had already collapsed. The walls were buckling inward, sending showers of embers into the night. Men with buckets worked to keep the fire from spreading to nearby buildings, throwing water that turned to steam before it hit the flames. But nobody was trying to save the school itself. It was beyond saving. 6 months of Elise's life, 6 months of lessons and laughter and children learning to see each other as equals, reduced to a column of fire against the Colorado sky. "There she is." The voice cut through the roar of the flames. Elise turned. Judge Harlan Creed stepped out of the crowd, his face arranged in an expression of grim authority. His suit was immaculate. His silver hair caught the firelight. He looked like a man who had been expecting this moment. "Miss Hartwell," he said loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. "The school was set on fire deliberately, and I think we all know who is responsible." The accusation hit Elise like a physical blow. The breath went out of her. For a moment, she could not speak, could not think, could only stare at the man who was framing her for the destruction of the one place she had loved most in this town. "You think I did this," she managed. "I think you have been stirring up trouble since you arrived in Blackstone. I think you have been using that laundry business to divide this town. And I think when decent people finally stood up to you, when men like Garrett Boone confronted you about your discriminatory practices, you decided to strike back at the institution that rejected you. That is insane." "Is it?" Creed's voice rose, carrying to every ear in the crowd. "You were fired from this school for insubordination. You publicly defied the school board. You have been running a business that discriminates against established families while favoring immigrants and troublemakers. And now, conveniently, the school burns down the very week you were warned about your conduct. I was 20 miles away. I was making the delivery to the Patterson Ranch. I have witnesses. You could have paid someone, one of your Irish laundry friends perhaps. They would do anything for you, seeing how you have made them so much money." The crowd was murmuring now, ugly whispers spreading like the smoke still rising from the ruins. Elise could feel it happening, the way fear and anger twisted into something irrational. The way people who should have known better were nodding along because Creed's story was simpler than the truth, and simpler was always easier to believe. "That is enough, Harlan." Caleb's voice cut through the noise like an axe through kindling. He appeared at Elise's side, his jaw set, his eyes hard. "You have no proof." "I have a burned school and a woman with a grudge. That is proof enough for most people in this territory." Sheriff Dale Harkin pushed through the crowd, his hand resting on his gun belt. Elise had never trusted Harkin. Everyone in Blackstone knew that the sheriff's salary from the town was a fraction of what Creed paid him on the side. "Miss Hartwell," Harkin said, his voice carrying the false gravity of a man performing authority rather than possessing it, I'm going to need you to come to my office and answer some questions. She is not going anywhere with you, Caleb said flatly. That is not your decision, Wren. It is when you are operating on Creed's orders instead of evidence. Harkin's face went dark. Careful, boy. I am not your boy. And she is not your suspect, not without evidence, not without due process. Or has Creed paid you enough to forget what those words mean? The crowd gasped. Nobody spoke to the sheriff that way. Nobody challenged Creed's authority this openly. Then Garrett Boone stepped forward, and the situation got worse. My son Colton says he saw Irish men near the school around 11 o'clock last night, carrying something that could have been kerosene. Colton is a bully who got disciplined for calling a 9-year-old girl a slur. Elise shot back. You would trust his word over mine? Over a dismissed teacher who has been plotting revenge for months, yes, absolutely. More voices joined. Families who resented the laundry's success. Men who had lost business when Bridget undercut their prices. The accusations piled up, each one more absurd than the last. That Elise had been seen buying kerosene. That she had made threats against the school board. That the Irish community had been celebrating the fire. Elise felt like she was drowning, standing in the middle of the street with the school burning behind her and the town turning against her in front of her, and no amount of truth seemed strong enough to hold back the flood of suspicion that Creed had so carefully prepared. Then Creed played his final card. If Miss Hartwell is gone by morning, he announced, raising his hands for silence, with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to being obeyed, I will personally oversee the rebuilding of the school, better than before, a proper institution for Blackstone's children, funded from my own resources. It was brilliant. It was monstrous. He was offering them something good in exchange for driving her out, making her departure look noble instead of cowardly, wrapping his cruelty in the language of generosity. Fine, Elise said. The word tasted like ash. I will leave. Elise, no. Caleb grabbed her arm. I will not let people get hurt because of me. The school is gone. If me leaving means it gets rebuilt, then that is what I will do. The crowd began to break apart. The fire was dying now, collapsing in on itself, and people drifted toward their homes with the stunned, hollow look of those who had witnessed something terrible and wanted nothing more than to forget it. But the night was not finished taking things from Elise Hartwell. She was walking toward the boarding house with Caleb when she heard the sound. Glass breaking, then shouting, then screaming from the direction of the Irish section of town. They ran. The east side of Blackstone was in chaos. Someone, maybe several someones, had decided that Creedy's accusation against the Irish community was permission enough to act. Windows were shattered. A door had been kicked in. Men with torches stood in the narrow street, shouting things that Elise could not process because her entire world had narrowed to a single point of focus. Grandma Bridget Calloway was lying on the ground in front of the laundry. Maeve was kneeling beside her, screaming for help. A stone the size of a man's fist lay nearby, slick with something dark. Blood. Elise dropped to her knees. Bridget was unconscious, her white hair matted with red, a wound above her left eye that was bleeding badly enough to pool on the frozen dirt beneath her head. What happened? Elise's voice came from somewhere far away, from a place beyond panic, a place where everything was very clear and very cold. They threw stones, Maeve sobbed. She was trying to get Fiona inside. She turned her back and they threw stones at an old woman protecting a child. Caleb was already shouting at the men with torches, driving them back with nothing but the force of his voice and the size of his fists. The mob scattered, cowards discovering the limits of their courage when confronted by someone who was not afraid of them. The town doctor arrived 20 minutes later. Elise held Bridget's hand the entire time, pressing cloths against the wound, watching the blood seep through the fabric, feeling each heartbeat as a small miracle that might stop at any moment. She will live, the doctor said finally, after an examination that lasted an eternity. He was an old man with shaking hands and breath that smelled of whiskey, and Elise hated him for both of those things. But he was the only doctor Blackstone had, so she listened. The skull is not fractured. She was fortunate. Fortunate, Elise repeated. But the eye. The doctor paused, cleaned his spectacles, put them back on. The left eye sustained severe damage from the impact. I have done what I can, but the vision in that eye will not return. I am sorry. The words fell into a silence that felt like the bottom of a well. Maeve made a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a sob. Something between the two that contained all the grief and rage a human throat could produce. Bridget Calloway, 65 years old, a woman who had survived the Great Famine of Ireland and crossed an ocean and built a life in a country that despised her for where she came from, had just lost the sight in her left eye because Elise Hartwell had refused to get on a train. Elise sat on the floor of the laundry beside the cot where they had laid Bridget. The old woman's breathing was steady, now drugged with laudanum, half her face wrapped in white bandages that were already starting to stain. Caleb sat beside Elise saying nothing. Maeve sat on the other side, holding her mother's hand. And somewhere in the back of the building, a small voice was crying. Fiona. Elise found her under the bed in the small room she shared with her mother. The girl was curled into a ball, her knees drawn to her chest, her face streaked with tears and snot and terror. Fiona, Elise said gently, lowering herself to the floor. It is Miss Hartwell. You remember me? A nod, barely visible in the darkness under the bed. Your grandmother is going to be all right. She is sleeping now. I saw them, Fiona whispered. I know, sweetheart. The men who threw the stones, I know. No, Fiona's voice dropped even lower. Not the stones, the fire. I saw the men who set the fire. Every cell in Elise's body went still. The school! Fiona continued, her words tumbling out fast like she had been holding them in so tightly that now they could not be contained. I could not sleep. I was at the window. I saw two men with torches and cans. They went inside the school and then the fire started. One of them was tall with a scar on his face. The other was shorter and he walked with a limp. I have seen them before. They work at Judge Creed's mine. They make deliveries. Fiona, why did you not tell anyone? The girl's face crumpled. The tall one saw me. He came to the door after. He said if I told anyone he would hurt grandmother. He said bad things would happen to my family. Her voice broke. And now bad things did happen. Grandmother is hurt. It is my fault because I did not tell and he hurt her anyway. Elise reached under the bed and pulled the child into her arms. Fiona clung to her with a strength that seemed impossible for someone so small, shaking so hard that Elise could feel it in her own bones. Listen to me. Elise said, her voice steady even though everything inside her was screaming. None of this is your fault. Not the fire. Not what happened to your grandmother. None of it. Do you understand me? You are 9 years old and you were brave beyond anything anyone should ever have to be. She held Fiona until the shaking stopped. Then she stood and walked out to where Caleb and Maeve were waiting. Creed's men burned the school, she said. Fiona saw them. They threatened her into silence. The words landed like stones into still water. Caleb's face went hard. Which men? One tall with a scar, one shorter with a limp. Mine workers. Tom Blake and Marcus Hall, Caleb said immediately. I know them. Creed's enforcers. They handle the jobs. Creed does not want traced back to him. Maeve stood. Her face was ashen, but her eyes were burning. So Creed burned the school, blamed Elise, and got my mother's skull cracked open in the process, all to drive out one woman who dared to challenge him. Yes, Elise said. What do we do? Elise looked at Bridget unconscious on the cot with half her face wrapped in bandages. She looked at Fiona sitting in the corner with her knees drawn up, a child who had been terrorized into silence by grown men. She looked at her own hands cracked and bleeding, the hands of a woman who had come west to teach children and had instead stumbled into a war she never asked for. She wanted to quit. She wanted to pack her suitcase and buy a ticket and get on the next train heading anywhere that was not here. She wanted to run until the memory of Bridget's blood on the frozen ground faded into something she could bear. But then she looked at Caleb and she saw something in his face that made running impossible. Not anger, though there was anger. Not pity, though there was grief. What she saw was faith, the unshakable, irrational belief that she would not give up, that the woman who had refused to board a train 2 months ago would refuse to board one now. We need evidence, she said. Fiona's testimony alone will not be enough. Creedy will say she imagined it, that she is a child, that she is Irish, that she is unreliable. We need more witnesses and we need something physical, something Creedy cannot deny or explain away. His ledgers, Maeve said. Everyone looked at her. My husband kept books for Creedy's mine before he died, Maeve said quietly. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. He used to say that Creedy ran 2 sets of records, one for the tax collectors, one that showed the real numbers. The real ledger had payments for things that could never be made public, bribes to Sheriff Harkin, payments to men who did work that had nothing to do with silver mining. Where are these ledgers? Caleb asked. The mine office, a locked safe in Creed's private room, behind a painting of a mountain. We cannot break into Creedy's office, Caleb said. That is not just illegal, it is suicidal. So we let him win, Elise shot back. We let a man who burned a school and terrorized a child and got an old woman half-blinded walk free because we were too afraid to do what needed to be done. I am not afraid. I am trying to keep you alive. And I am trying to make being alive mean something. They stared at each other across the room, and the air between them was charged with everything they had not yet said. The love that was still too new to carry this much weight. The fear that they were heading somewhere from which there would be no return. Then Bridget stirred on the cot. Her one unbandaged eye opened cloudy with pain and laudanum, but focused enough to find Elise's face. "If you leave now," Bridget said, her voice barely a whisper, "I lost this eye for nothing." The words settled the argument more completely than any logic could have. "We go tomorrow night," Elise said. Caleb closed his eyes, opened them, nodded. "Then we need to move fast," he said, "and we need help." By morning, they had a plan. By afternoon, Caleb had returned from his ranch with the man who would make it possible. His name was Virgil Strand. He was 60 years old, lean as rawhide, with hands that shook slightly when they were still, but became perfectly steady when they were working. He had been a locksmith in Denver before something happened, something neither he nor Caleb would discuss, that sent him out of the city and into the mountains. Now he worked as a handyman on Caleb's ranch, fixing fences and shoeing horses and keeping to himself. Virgil listened to the plan with the expression of a man watching someone step in front of a moving train. "You want me to crack Harlan Creed's safe," he said slowly. "The same Creed who owns the mine, controls the sheriff, and has people beaten for looking at him sideways." "Yes," Elise said. "And you think this is a good idea?" "I think it is the only idea." Virgil looked at Caleb. "You are letting her do this." "I am not letting her do anything. She has already decided. I am just trying to make sure she survives it." Virgil sighed, a long, heavy sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his history. "My wife, God rest her, always said I had more courage than sense. I suppose she was right." "Will you help us?" Elise asked. "Give me a reason." "Because someone has to stand up. Because if we do not stop Creed now, he will keep destroying anyone who threatens his control. Today it is me. Tomorrow it is someone else. Eventually it is everyone." Virgil studied her for a long moment. Then he reached under his coat and pulled out a roll of leather, the kind used to hold tools. He unrolled it on the table. Inside were lockpicks and tension wrenches and instruments Elise could not name, all of them polished and precise. "Tomorrow night," Virgil said, "and if I die doing this, you tell my wife it was for a good cause." "I thought your wife passed away." "She did, but I plan on seeing her again, and I would rather she be proud of me when I get there." The day that followed was the longest of Elise's life. She worked at the laundry because stopping would have attracted attention. She pressed shirts and folded sheets and delivered orders and smiled at customers, while her mind ran through the plan again and again, looking for flaws, finding dozens, and pushing forward anyway. At dusk, she visited Bridget. The old woman was sitting up now, one eye bandaged, the other bright with pain and determination. "You are going tonight," Bridget said. It was not a question. "Yes." "Then come back alive. I did not lose this eye so you could get yourself killed being heroic. I will come back. And bring me something worth the price we have paid." Elise squeezed her hand. Then she turned and walked out into the Colorado night toward whatever was waiting in the darkness. The plan was simple. The execution would not be. But Elise Hartwell had let one train leave without her. She had kissed a mountain man on a freezing porch. She had watched an old woman lose her sight and a child lose her innocence, and a town lose its soul to a man who believed his cruelty was civilization. She was done waiting for someone else to fix it. Tomorrow she would either expose Harlan Creed for what he was, or she would lose everything she had left. Either way, she would not spend another day pretending that the truth did not matter. She found Caleb and Virgil waiting at the edge of town in shadows against the darker shadow of the mountains. The moon was a sliver, the stars were cold, and somewhere up the hill in an office lit by a single lamp, a safe held secrets that could burn an empire to the ground. Elise touched the place on her wrist where Caleb had grabbed her on the train platform 2 months ago. The bruise had long since faded, but she could still feel it. The grip that had stopped her from running. The hand that had pulled her into a life she never imagined. "Ready?" Caleb asked. "No," Elise said. "Let us go anyway." They moved into the darkness together, 3 people carrying the weight of a truth that Blackstone was not yet ready to hear. Behind them, in a small house on the east side of town, a 9-year-old girl sat beside her grandmother's bed and whispered prayers to a God she hoped was listening. And in the laundry that smelled of lie and labor and stubborn survival, a candle burned in the window like a promise that someone would be coming home. Whether they would come home free or in chains was a question the night had not yet answered. The mine office sat at the edge of Blackstone like a clenched fist. A squat building of rough-hewn stone with barred windows and a single door reinforced with iron bands. It had been built to hold secrets, and it did its job well. Elise crouched behind a stack of timber 50 yards away, her breath shallow, her heart hammering against her ribs with a violence that made her dizzy. Caleb was beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body through the December air. Virgil Strand knelt on her other side, his roll of locksmith tools tucked inside his coat, his weathered face unreadable in the darkness. The night guard made his round at 12:15. They watched him pass a heavy-set man in a sheepskin coat carrying a lantern that threw a weak circle of yellow light across the frozen ground. He walked the perimeter of the building without enthusiasm, pausing once to blow into his hands, then disappeared around the far corner and did not reappear. 30 minutes before he comes back, Caleb whispered. That is what I have observed the last 3 nights. 30 minutes is plenty, Virgil said. He did not sound confident. He sounded like a man stating a fact that happened to terrify him. They moved fast. Caleb led them to the back entrance, a secondary door, used for deliveries that was secured with a padlock and a chain. Virgil had the padlock open in 40 seconds. The chain slithered free with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Inside the office smelled of tobacco and old paper, and the faint chemical tang of ink. Caleb lit a small lantern, keeping the flame so low it barely pushed back the darkness. The front room was administrative, cluttered with filing cabinets and a battered desk covered in correspondence. Elise's fingers itched to search through it, but they did not have time for anything except the objective. Maeve's map led them down a short hallway to a door at the end. Creed's private office, locked, but Virgil handled it with the same quiet efficiency, his shaking hands becoming perfectly steady the moment his tools touched metal. The room beyond was larger than Elise expected. A mahogany desk dominated the center, polished to a gleam that caught the lantern light. Bookshelves lined 2 walls. A gun cabinet stood in the corner, its glass doors reflecting distorted versions of their faces. And on the wall behind the desk, exactly where Maeve had described, hung a large oil painting of a mountain peak wreathed in clouds. Caleb lifted the painting away. Behind it, set into the stone wall, was a steel safe with a combination dial. Virgil knelt in front of it and pressed his ear against the cool metal. His fingers found the dial and began to turn it with the delicate precision of a surgeon. How long? Caleb whispered. Could be 5 minutes. Could be an hour. Safes do not operate on schedules. We do not have an hour. The guard comes back in 20 minutes. Then I suggest you stop talking and let me work. Elise positioned herself by the office door, watching the hallway, listening for any sound beyond the tick of Virgil's work and the thunder of her own pulse. The building groaned in the wind. A mouse scratched somewhere behind the walls. Normal sounds that her terrified mind transformed into footsteps, into voices, into the click of a rifle being cocked. A click from the safe. Real this time. Virgil grunted softly. Almost, he breathed. Then Elise heard something that was not the wind and was not a mouse. Boots on gravel. Not the slow, bored cadence of the night guard. Something faster, something purposeful, multiple sets of feet moving toward the building. Someone is coming, she hissed. I'm too close to stop. Another click. The dial spun. Virgil's hands moved with desperate speed, abandoning caution for velocity. The front door crashed open. Lantern light flooded the hallway. Elise pressed herself against the wall of Creed's office, her back flat against the stone, her hands clenched into fists. Caleb extinguished their lantern, and the room plunged into darkness. But it was too late. The light from the hallway was already spilling through the open office door, and the footsteps were coming closer, and Virgil was still kneeling in front of the safe with his tools inside it. A final click. The safe door swung open. And in the same moment, the office door swung wide and Harlan Creed stepped through it. He was flanked by 2 men Elise had never seen before. Not Blake and Hall, the men who had burned the school. These were replacements. Larger, armed. One carried a rifle. The other held a shotgun with the casual ease of someone who had used it before and would not hesitate to use it again. Creedy held a lantern in one hand. Its light filled the room, erasing every shadow, exposing every hiding place. He was dressed in a dark suit as if he had been expecting company. His silver hair was perfectly combed. His expression was calm, almost pleasant, the expression of a chess player who has seen the endgame 15 moves in advance and is simply waiting for the pieces to fall. Miss Hartwell, he said, breaking and entering. That is a serious crime. Elisa's mind raced through options and found none. They were caught, completely undeniably, catastrophically caught. Creed was standing between them and the only exit, and his men had enough firepower to end 3 lives before any of them could reach the hallway. "We were looking for evidence," Elise said. She was amazed at how steady her voice sounded when her entire body was trembling. "Evidence that you ordered Blake and Hall to burn the school. Interesting theory." Creed set his lantern on the desk and sat down behind it as if this were a business meeting rather than a confrontation. "Unfortunately, you are in my office illegally, which means anything you find is inadmissible, even if you survive long enough to present it." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Caleb's hand moved toward the pistol at his hip. The man with the rifle shifted his aim to Caleb's chest. A small movement, an efficient one, the movement of someone who had done this before. "Do not," Creedy said. "I would hate to explain why I had to shoot 3 burglars in self-defense, though I suppose it would not be difficult. The disgraced teacher, her mountain man, and an old locksmith with a criminal past." He glanced at Virgil. "Yes, Mr. Strand, I know who you are. I know why you left Denver, and I know that a conviction for safecracking would send you back to the territorial prison you barely survived the first time." Virgil said nothing. He was still kneeling in front of the open safe. "The whole town knows we came here," Elise said. It was a lie, a desperate, transparent lie. But it was all she had. Creed smiled. "The whole town will assume you died attempting a burglary. Tragic but predictable. The disgraced teacher driven mad by resentment, breaking into a respected citizen's office in a deranged attempt at revenge. People will shake their heads and say they saw it coming." He leaned forward, and for the first time the pleasant mask slipped. Underneath it was something cold and absolute, the face of a man who had clawed his way up from the gutters and would burn the world to ashes before he let anyone drag him back down. "I tried to handle this humanely, Miss Hartwell. I gave you multiple opportunities to leave. I even explained to you personally why what I have built matters. But you insisted on making this a war, and in war people die." "People have already been hurt," Elise shot back. "Granted, Bridget lost the sight in her eye because your accusations turned a mob loose on the Irish section of town. A 9-year-old girl was threatened by your men into keeping silent about arson. Those are the consequences of your order, Judge, your civilization." Something shifted in Creed's face, a flicker of something that might have been discomfort, but it passed quickly, buried under the granite certainty that had carried him through 55 years of survival. "Collateral damage is unfortunate," he said, "but it does not change the fundamental equation. Order requires sacrifice, progress requires control, and you, Miss Hartwell, represent chaos. I represent the truth, and you are afraid of it. I am afraid of nothing. I am a man who has slept in gutters and eaten garbage and watched every person who should have helped me turn their backs. Fear is a luxury for people who have never had to fight for every breath. I do not fear you. I simply recognize that you are an obstacle to the stability of this town, and I am removing you." He stood. The chair scraped against the floor. "Kill them," he said to his men. "Make it look like they resisted." "The safe is open," Virgil said quietly. Everyone looked at him. He was still kneeling, his hands inside the safe, his voice steady despite the death sentence that had just been pronounced. "If you remove anything from that safe," Creed said carefully, "my men will shoot all 3 of you before you reach the door. Are you prepared to die for whatever is in there?" Elise looked at Caleb, at Virgil, at the rifles pointed at their bodies. She looked at Creed and saw the fear he claimed not to feel, hidden beneath 50 years of armor, but visible now in the tightness around his eyes, in the way his fingers gripped the edge of the desk. The fear of a man whose secrets are about to be dragged into the light. She thought of Bridget lying on a cot with half her face wrapped in bandages. She thought of Fiona crying under a bed. She thought of the school burning against the night sky and the children who would never sit in its classrooms again. "Yes," she said, "I am prepared to die for the truth." She lunged for the safe. Creed shouted. His men raised their weapons, and 3 things happened in a single violent second that changed everything. Caleb threw himself at the man with the rifle, driving his shoulder into the man's chest, with enough force to send them both crashing into the bookshelf. Books cascaded around them. The rifle discharged into the ceiling, sending a shower of plaster and stone dust down onto the desk. Elise's hands closed around a leather-bound ledger inside the safe. It was heavy, the size of a family Bible, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. She pulled it free and in the same motion threw it across the room to Virgil, who caught it with reflexes that belied his 60 years. The man with the shotgun swung toward Virgil. Elise grabbed the lantern from Creed's desk and hurled it. Not at the man, at the floor in front of him. Glass shattered, kerosene splashed, flames erupted in a sheet that drove the gunman backwards, shielding his face with his arms. "Run!" Caleb roared. He had the rifleman pinned against the bookshelf, but the man was bigger and was already breaking free. Good now. Virgil did not need to be told twice. He was through the office door and down the hallway before Elise could draw her next breath. She followed her boots, slipping on the stone floor, the heat of the kerosene fire licking at her back. Behind her, she heard Caleb break free from the rifleman, heard his boots pounding down the hallway, heard Creedy screaming orders that echoed off the stone walls. They burst through the back door into the December night. The cold air hit Elise like a wall. Virgil was already running the ledger clutched against his chest, his wounded shoulder leaving a dark trail on his coat. Because somewhere in the chaos, the shotgun had fired and the pellets had found flesh. A gunshot cracked behind them. Then another. Wood splintered off a fence post inches from Elise's head. She veered left, zigzagging between buildings, her lungs burning, her vision narrowing to the patch of frozen ground immediately in front of her feet. "The church!" Caleb gasped. He was beside her now, running with the desperate speed of a man who understood exactly what was at stake. "Ring the bell." Elise understood immediately. The church bell was Blackstone's emergency signal. Fire, attack, catastrophe. It had not rung in 2 years, not since a flash flood threatened the lower town. But everyone in Blackstone knew its sound, and everyone knew what it meant. "Get up, come outside. Something is happening that cannot wait until morning." They reached the church 30 seconds ahead of Creed's men. Caleb threw open the double doors, and Elise and Virgil stumbled inside, gasping their breath, making white clouds in the frigid air of the unheated sanctuary. Virgil staggered toward the bell rope, leaving a smear of blood on the pew he grabbed for support. His face was gray with pain, but his hands found the rope and pulled. The bell began to toll. It was a deep sound, a sound that carried across the valley and echoed off the mountains and penetrated the walls of every building in Blackstone. It was the sound of something that could not be ignored. While Virgil rang the bell, Caleb dragged pews across the front doors. Not a barricade that would hold forever, but enough to slow anyone trying to force entry. Elise lit every lantern she could find, filling the church with light that spilled through the windows and out into the street. Within minutes, the first lights appeared in houses across town. Doors opened. People emerged in coats thrown over nightclothes, their faces confused and frightened and drawn toward the tolling bell by an instinct older than reason. Creedy's men reached the church. Elise could see them through the window, two dark shapes standing in the street with their weapons visible. But they did not attempt to enter. There were too many witnesses now, too many eyes, too many people watching from doorways and windows, and the street itself drawn from sleep by the bell that was still ringing, ringing, ringing. Sheriff Dale Harkin arrived, his coat unbuttoned, his hat, missing, looking like a man who had been pulled from a deep sleep and was not pleased about it. "What in God's name is happening?" he demanded. Elise stepped to the church door. She was bleeding from a cut on her forehead she did not remember receiving. Her dress was torn, her hands were shaking, but her voice when it came was clear and strong and carried across the street to every ear in the growing crowd. "We have proof," she said, "proof that Judge Harlan Creed ordered the school burned." She held up the ledger. Creedy appeared at the edge of the crowd. He was breathing hard. His suit was disheveled. For the first time in Elise's memory, the perfect facade cracked just enough to show the man underneath. But his voice was controlled when he spoke. "That is stolen property, taken during an illegal break-in at my office. Nothing in that book has any legal standing." "Then arrest us," Elise said. "Right here, in front of everyone. Arrest us for stealing the evidence that proves you are a criminal." The crowd was growing. Miners and merchants and ranchers and their wives, all of them staring at the scene unfolding in the lamplight with the wide-eyed intensity of people watching something they knew they would remember for the rest of their lives. Harkin looked between Elise and Creed, caught in a trap that had no good exit. If he arrested Elise, he confirmed his role as Creed's puppet. If he did not, he defied the man who had been paying his real salary for a decade. "Show us what is in the book," a voice shouted from the crowd. Elise recognized the speaker. Henderson, the merchant who owned the general store. A man who had never taken sides in anything and was taking one now. "It is private business records," Creed said quickly. "Confidential financial information that has nothing to do with any fire." "Then you have nothing to hide?" Elise replied. She opened the ledger with hands that trembled despite her best efforts to hold them steady. The pages were dense with entries coded and abbreviated, written in a cramped hand that would take weeks to fully decipher. But she did not need weeks. She needed one entry. And Maeve had told her exactly what to look for. December 14th, she read aloud. Payment to TB and MH for structural removal and misdirection, $200. She looked up at Creed. Tom Blake and Marcus Hall, the date the school burned. Structural removal. Is that what you call arson, Judge? That is a legitimate payment for demolition work on a building I owned on the South Road, Creedy said smoothly. Nothing sinister, nothing connected to the school. Which building? What address? A pause. The briefest hesitation before Creedy answered, but long enough for everyone watching to notice. I do not recall the specific details offhand, because the building does not exist. You paid Blake and Hall $200 on the same night the school burned, the same night witnesses saw them with kerosene and torches, the same night they threatened a 9-year-old girl into silence. Elise turned to the crowd. Fiona, are you here? A small figure stepped forward from behind Maeve. Fiona Calloway, 9 years old, wearing a coat 2 sizes too large, her face pale and terrified. But she was standing. She had come. Tell them what you saw, sweetheart, Elise said gently. Fiona's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence of that street, it carried like a shout. I saw 2 men set fire to the school. From my window. They had torches and cans of something that smelled bad. One was tall with a scar on his face. The other walked with a limp. I have seen them before at Judge Creedy's mine. They bring things to the office sometimes. The child is confused, Creedy said. It was dark. She could not possibly have identified anyone from her window. I saw them too. A new voice, everyone turned. A ranch hand named Cooper, a quiet man who worked the Patterson spread, stepped out of the crowd. His face was set with the grim determination of someone who had been carrying a secret too heavy to hold any longer. I was coming back from a poker game around 11:30, saw 2 men near the school carrying cans and rags, recognized Tom Blake right away. That scar is hard to miss. I saw them as well. Another voice, a widow named Mrs. Garrison who lived alone in a house across the street from the school. I could not sleep. I watched from my window. 2 men, one limped badly. They went inside the school and 10 minutes later, the fire started. One by one, they came forward. 6 witnesses in all, each one adding another crack to the wall of lies Creedy had built. A miner who had recognized Blake and Hall, but had been too afraid to speak. A shopkeeper who had seen them buying kerosene the afternoon before the fire. Ordinary people who had been held silent by fear and were now stepping into the light because a 9-year-old girl had found the courage to go first. Creedy watched it happen. His face underwent a transformation that Elise would remember for the rest of her life. The polished mask of the civilized judge, the benevolent patriarch who had pulled himself from the gutters to build a town, crumbled piece by piece, replaced by something raw and wounded and furious. And then he did something Elise did not expect. He told the truth. You want to know who I am? His voice rose not with the controlled authority he usually projected, but with something deeper. Something that came from the orphaned boy who had eaten garbage and slept under church steps. I built this town when there was nothing here but mud and violence and men who would shoot each other over a card game. I brought order. I opened the mine. I built the buildings. I paved the roads. I created the law. He pointed at the crowd, his finger sweeping across them like an accusation. Every one of you owes your livelihood to me. Your homes, your businesses, the food on your tables. When the railroad wanted to bypass Blackstone, I paid for the spur line from my own pocket. When the drought of '81 killed half the cattle in the territory, I extended credit to every rancher in this valley. I kept this town alive when no one else would. His voice cracked. The first genuine emotion Elise had ever heard from him. And you call me a criminal because I removed a building that was being used to spread dangerous ideas, because I made decisions that kept this town stable and prosperous and safe. You call that arson. I call it protecting everything I spent my life building. The silence that followed was enormous. Elise could see the conflict on people's faces. Creed was not lying, not entirely. He had built Blackstone. He had kept it functioning through hardship. He had done things for this town that no one else was willing to do. And that made the betrayal worse because it meant the man who had given them so much was also the man who had burned their children's school and blamed an innocent woman for it. Elise stepped forward. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the night air like a blade. You did build this town, Judge. Nobody is denying that. But you did not build it for them. You built it for yourself. You built it so that nobody could ever look down on you again, so that nobody could make you feel the way you felt when you were that hungry child on the streets. Creed's face went white. And that is the tragedy of it, Elise continued, because somewhere along the way, the boy who was hurt by powerful people became the man who hurts powerless people. You did not bring order to Blackstone. You brought control. And when a school teacher dared to treat all children equally, when she challenged your version of how the world should work, you burned down a school. You terrorized a child. You got an old woman half-blinded, not to protect this town, to protect yourself. You know nothing about what I have sacrificed, Creedy said, but his voice had lost its force. The certainty that had carried him through a lifetime of domination was fracturing under the weight of 6 witnesses, a ledger full of secrets, and a truth he had spent years bearing. I know that sacrifice is not the same as destruction, Elise said. I know that building something does not give you the right to burn it down when it stops serving your purposes. And I know that the children of this town deserve better than a man who decides their education based on whether it threatens his power. She turned to Sheriff Harkin. Sheriff, you have testimony from multiple witnesses. You have a ledger documenting payments to the men identified as arsonists. You have a pattern of bribery and corruption spanning years. Are you going to enforce the law, or are you going to confirm that Judge Creed owns you completely? Every eye in Blackstone fixed on Dale Harkin, the man who had spent a decade taking Creed's money and looking the other way. The man whose daughter attended the school that Creed had burned. Harkin's face worked through emotions like a man drowning in them. Fear, shame, anger, self-preservation, and finally something that looked almost like relief. The relief of a man who had been carrying a weight he could no longer bear and was being given permission to set it down. Harlan Creed, Harkin said. His voice shook, but he did not stop. You are under arrest for bribery and corruption of public officials. Creed stared at him. You cannot be serious. I am done, Harlan. Done being your man. Done pretending that what you do to this town is justice. Done lying to my daughter about what her father does for a living. You are finished in Blackstone. You understand that finished. Maybe, but I will be able to look my children in the eye. Harkin's deputies moved forward. Creede looked at them, then at the crowd, then at the ledger in Elise's hands. And she watched him make a calculation that took perhaps 2 seconds, but seemed to span a lifetime. Resist and confirm everything she had said, or submit and retain at least the possibility of fighting back through lawyers and courtrooms and the grinding machinery of a legal system that favored the wealthy. He chose the calculation. This is not over, he said as they led him away. I have lawyers, I have resources. You have not won anything. We have won the truth, Elise replied. That is enough for now. The crowd did not erupt into celebration. This was not that kind of victory. It was the kind that left people shaken and uncertain, looking at each other and at the town they lived in with new eyes. Some approached Elise with apologies. Others avoided her gaze, ashamed of their earlier silence. A few stayed behind when the rest dispersed. Henderson the merchant was one of them. About that school, he said gruffly, I have lumber, and I have hands that know how to use it. Tommy Patterson's father nodded. My boys need a proper school. I will help build it. Others joined. Not many, not yet, but enough. Caleb found Elise in the aftermath when the crowd had thinned and the torches had burned down and the first gray light of dawn was beginning to outline the mountains. You almost got us killed tonight, he said. I know. You broke into a man's office based on a dead woman's husband's memory and nearly started a gunfight in the middle of town. I know. Virgil took shotgun pellets in his shoulder. I know, Caleb. I know all of it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled her close and held her, and she let herself collapse against his chest and felt for the first time in hours like she could breathe. I love you, he said. The words came out raw and unguarded and completely without pretense. I have been trying not to say it because it seemed too fast, too soon. But I almost lost you tonight, and I am done pretending. Elise's throat tightened. Her eyes burned. She pressed her face against his coat and felt his heartbeat against her cheek, steady and strong. The heartbeat of a man who had grabbed her wrist on a train platform and asked for one chance and had stood beside her through everything that followed. I love you too, she whispered, even though you are right about the crazy part. So what happens now? She pulled back and looked at the town, at the empty street and the smoldering ruins of the old school and the mountains that were beginning to catch the first pink light of a Colorado sunrise. Now we build the school, she said. the one Blackstone actually needs. The weeks that followed were not easy. Nothing in Blackstone had ever been easy. Creedy's lawyers were expensive and skilled. They argued that the ledger was obtained through illegal means and should be ruled inadmissible. They claimed Blake and Hall, who had vanished the night of the fire and had not been found, had acted independently without Creed's knowledge. They painted their client as a victim of ambitious people trying to destroy a respected community leader. The trial dragged through the winter and into the spring. Sheriff Harkin, finding courage he did not know he possessed, cooperated with federal marshals who arrived in February to investigate Creed's mine operations. What they found went beyond arson: fraud, tax evasion, worker exploitation, a decade of systematic corruption documented in the very ledgers that Elise had risked her life to retrieve. But the law, as Elise was learning, did not always deliver the justice that people deserved. The verdict came down on a warm day in May: guilty of bribery and corruption of public officials. 5 years in territorial prison, not guilty of arson due to insufficient admissible evidence. Elise sat in the courtroom and listened to the words and felt something break inside her that she had not known was still intact. Not guilty of arson. The school had burned. Bridget had lost her eye. Fiona had been terrorized into silence. And the man who ordered it all would never be held accountable for that specific crime. "It is not enough," she said to Caleb afterward, standing on the courthouse steps in the spring sunshine. No, he agreed, it is not. He burned the school and walked away from it. He is going to prison for 5 years. His mine is being sold. His properties are being auctioned. His influence is gone. But he will never admit what he did. The record will say not guilty, and that is what people will remember. Caleb took her hands. People will remember what you did, Elise. They will remember who stood up and who backed down and who told the truth when it mattered. That is what lasts. Not verdicts, not legal records. The truth. That evening, Elise visited Bridget. The old woman was sitting up in a chair by the window of the laundry, her left eye permanently covered by a patch of dark cloth that Maeve had sewn with careful, heartbroken precision. She was thinner than before, and the lines in her face had deepened, but her remaining eye was bright and sharp and missed nothing. "I heard," Bridget said. 5 years for corruption, nothing for the school. Justice is a luxury, child, always has been. Perfect justice is for people who can afford perfect lawyers. The rest of us take what we can get. It does not feel like enough. It never does." Bridget reached out and took Elise's hand. "But that man is in prison. His empire is dust. And we are still here, still standing, still fighting. If that is not enough, I do not know what is." Elise looked at the patch over Bridget's eye, the scar that would never heal, the price that had been paid for the truth. "You lost your eye because of me," Elise said. The words had been inside her for months, and they came out now with the force of something that could no longer be contained. "I lost my eye because of a mob that threw rocks at an old woman," Bridget corrected firmly. "I lost my eye because Creed turned people against each other. I did not lose it because of you, Elise Hartwell. And if you spend one more minute believing that I will use my one good eye to give you such a look that you will wish you had never met me." Despite everything, Elise smiled. "Thank you, Bridget. Do not thank me. Build the school. Make it worth what we paid." Construction began 3 days later on a flat stretch of land that Caleb had donated from his ranch. Good land, high ground with solid drainage, and a view of the Rocky Mountains that made your chest expand just from looking at it. His foreman staked out the foundation while volunteers hauled timber from Henderson's supply. It was bigger than the old school, Caleb had insisted. Room for 60 students, room for growth, room for the future they were building. Elise threw herself into the project with the same intensity she had brought to the laundry, but this time it was different. This time she was not fighting against something. She was building toward it. And the distinction she discovered changed everything about how the work felt. Tommy Patterson's father came every morning before heading to his own ranch, his sons helping to carry boards and drive nails. Henderson supplied materials and worked alongside the laborers, his merchant's hands developing blisters he wore like badges of honor. Even Virgil Strand appeared, his shoulders still bandaged, to supervise the foundation work. "You saved our lives in that office," Elise told him, "and got myself shot doing it. Are you sorry? Ask me when I can lift my arm above my head again." But he was smiling when he said it, and he kept coming back day after day until the building began to take shape. In late May, Margaret Wells was elected to lead the newly reformed town council. She was a rancher's widow who had run her husband's property alone after his death, and turned it into one of the most productive spreads in the territory. She had a no-nonsense manner and eyes that could freeze a liar at 30 paces. She asked Elise to present the academy plan at the council's first meeting. Elise stood before them with her notes and her numbers and her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. Not just a school, she said, an academy, open to every child who wants to learn regardless of their family's name or their parents' income or where they came from. Students who can afford tuition will pay, and that money will subsidize those who cannot. Every child is equal. Every child matters. That is radical, Miss Hartwell, Wells said. So is teaching boys and girls in the same classroom. It worked. Wells studied her for a long moment. Then she smiled a small, private smile that carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. My daughter still talks about the 3 months you taught her, Wells said. She learned more in that time than in the entire previous year. The council approves your academy with one condition. Name it. You run it. Not as a temporary teacher, but as permanent headmistress. We want someone who will fight for these principles when the next Harlan Creed comes along, because there is always a next one. Elise heard herself say, I accept. The academy opened in March of 1884. 32 students enrolled the first week. By April, the number had doubled. Elise hired 2 additional teachers, a young woman from Philadelphia who had come west seeking something she could not name and found it in a classroom full of eager faces, and a former miner named Douglas who had taught himself Latin and mathematics during long winters underground and possessed a quiet patience that made even the most difficult students feel safe. The children flourished. Fiona Calloway, finally free from the terror that had silenced her, became the academy's brightest student. She read everything she could get her hands on and started helping teach the younger children with a natural gift that made Elise's heart swell. Colton Boone enrolled in April. His father Garrett had lost the lumber mill in the economic upheaval following Creedy's arrest and had left Blackstone in quiet disgrace. But Colton had stayed living with an uncle and had asked to attend the academy with a humility that surprised everyone who remembered the bully he had been. He turned out to be gifted at mathematics, and one afternoon Elise found him sitting next to Fiona at the front table. Both of them bent over a geometry problem, the slur he had called her a lifetime ago, buried under the simple redeeming fact of learning together. Tommy Patterson started writing poetry. A rancher's daughter discovered chemistry. The academy became what Elise had always believed a school could be, a place where children discovered who they were instead of being told who they had to be. On a warm evening in late May, Caleb found Elise sitting by the spring that fed the creek running through his ranch. She came here often now. The sound of running water in the enormous Colorado sky did something to her thoughts that she could not quite explain. Untangled them, made them clearer. Long day at the academy, he asked, settling beside her on the flat rock she had claimed as her own. Fiona gave a presentation on Irish folklore today. She translated 3 old stories from memory and explained their historical context to the entire class. Colton Boone asked if she could teach him some of the language so he could understand the originals. Colton Boone, the same boy who called her a filthy name 8 months ago. People can change when they are given a reason to. Like you gave me a reason to change. You did not need to change, Caleb. You just needed someone to see who you already were. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. It was rough-hewn hand, carved with a quality of craftsmanship that spoke of many hours of careful work. The kind of thing a mountain man would make with his own hands, because buying something from a store seemed insufficient for the magnitude of what it was meant to contain. Elise's heart stopped. I had a whole speech prepared, he said, opening the box. Inside, resting on a scrap of blue velvet, was a simple gold band. Not large, not ornate. The kind of ring that said everything it needed to say without shouting. But every version of the speech sounded wrong, he continued. Too flowery, too casual, too something. So I am just going to say what I feel, and you can do with it what you will. He turned to face her. The light was failing, the sun dropping behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of copper and rose. His face was half in shadow and half in gold, and his eyes held the same expression she had seen on the train platform 6 months ago. That honest desperation, that refusal to let something precious slip away without fighting for it. I fell in love with you the night you stepped off that train, he said. The night you chose the uncertain future over the safe past. Every day since then, you have proven that you are braver and smarter and more stubborn than anyone I have ever met. You have changed this town. You have changed me. And I want to spend the rest of my life watching you change the world one impossible dream at a time. Elise's eyes burned. She pressed her lips together and tasted salt. If you had boarded that train last October, Caleb continued, his voice steady despite the emotion cracking through it, none of this would exist. The academy would not be teaching 64 students. Fiona would still be afraid to speak. Colton Boone would still be a bully. Blackstone would still be controlled in whoever had the most money and the fewest scruples. You are giving me too much credit. I am giving you exactly the credit you have earned. You did not rescue this town, Elise. You gave it permission to rescue itself. He held out the ring. The gold caught the last light and held it. You turned my mountain from a lonely place into a home, he said. Will you marry me? Elise looked at the man who had grabbed her wrist on a train platform and asked for one chance. The man who had walked beside her through fire and fear and the long, brutal work of building something from nothing. The man who believed the world could be better and was willing to bleed for it. Yes, she said. Yes, absolutely yes. He slipped the ring on her finger. It fit perfectly because, of course it did, because he had been paying attention from the very beginning. They sat together by the spring as the last light drained from the sky and the stars appeared one by one like promises being made by a universe that occasionally kept them. They married in June in the academy building they had fought so hard to create. Half the territory seemed to attend. Grandma Bridget sewed Elise's dress herself, working with one eye and two steady hands that had not lost a stitch of their skill. Fiona read a poem about new beginnings that she had written herself, and her voice did not shake once. Even Sheriff Harkin came bringing his daughter, who had enrolled in the academy in April and was already near the top of her class. He shook Elise's hand and said, "Thank you," and that was all, and it was enough. The ceremony was simple. The celebration was not. Music and food and laughter that spilled out of the academy and into the evening lanterns strung between trees, children running between the legs of adults who had forgotten briefly to be serious. Caleb danced with Elise under a sky so full of stars, it looked like God had scattered diamonds across black velvet. "Happy?" he asked as they swayed to the fiddle music. "Happier than I ever thought possible." "Good, because I have one more surprise. I do not know if I can handle more surprises." He led her away from the celebration to a rise where a wagon was parked. From the top of the rise, she could see land stretching in every direction, acres and acres of mountain country rolling toward the peaks. "I have been buying parcels," he said, "land surrounding the academy, enough to build a real community, homes for teachers, houses for families, a lending library, maybe someday a hospital. That must have cost everything you had. Everything I could spare, and it is worth every cent. We are not just building a school, Elise. We are building the kind of place people come to instead of leaving. The kind of place where who you are matters more than who your parents were. We are building a dream. We are building a future. There is a difference." 1 year after Elise Hartwell almost boarded a train back to Boston, she stood on the steps of the Blackstone Academy on the first day of a new school year. 83 students from 7 different regions filed past her into classrooms where they would be challenged and respected and taught to see each other as equals. Fiona Calloway, 10 years old now, and already helping teach the younger students, paused at the door and looked back at Elise with a smile that contained everything words could not hold. Gratitude, trust, the quiet, unshakable belief that someone in the world would always fight for her. Colton Boone walked in beside a boy whose family had just arrived from the mining camps, the two of them already deep in an argument about mathematics that would have been impossible a year ago. Tommy Patterson carried a notebook full of poems he wanted to share with the class. And Grandma Bridget sat on a bench beneath the porch overhang, her eye patch dark against her white hair, her one good eye watching the children stream past with an expression of fierce protective pride. Maeve sat beside her, both of them, wrapped in shawls against the October chill, watching the future walk through the door their sacrifice had built. Caleb joined Elise on the steps. His hand found hers automatically the way it always did now, as natural as breathing. "Thinking about that train?" he asked. "Always. I think about it every day." "Regrets?" "Not even one." She paused. "I think about how close I came to giving up, how easy it would have been to board that train and convince myself that Blackstone was not worth fighting for, that I was not worth fighting for. But you did not." "No, because a mountain man grabbed my wrist and asked for one chance, and I was brave enough or foolish enough to give it to him." "Best decision you ever made." Elise looked at the academy, at the children disappearing into classrooms, at the community that was growing around the building like a living thing, houses and gardens, and the beginnings of the lending library that Caleb had promised. She looked at Bridget's face, scarred but undefeated, at Fiona's smile, bright as morning, at the ring on her own finger, simple gold that held the weight of everything they had built. She looked at the mountains, enormous and ancient and indifferent to the small human dramas playing out in their shadow. But the mountains were still there, and so was she, and so was the school, and so were the children inside it, learning that the world did not have to be the way powerful men said it had to be. The best decision I ever made, Elise said, was choosing to stay and fight when every voice in my head screamed to run. Choosing to believe that one person standing up could actually make a difference. Choosing you in this town, in this impossible dream of building something better. Caleb pulled her close. And look what you built. We built, Elise corrected. None of this was just me. Maybe, but you are the one who refused to get on that train. You are the one who turned one chance into a lifetime. The school bell rang. Clear and bright, it echoed across the valley and up into the mountains and out into the vast Colorado sky. It was a small sound against the enormity of the wilderness, but it carried. Elise kissed her husband once quickly, the way married people do when there is work waiting and a whole day ahead and a lifetime still unfolding. Then she turned and walked through the door of the academy into the warmth and noise and beautiful chaos of 83 children waiting to learn. She had come west as a dismissed teacher with nothing but principles and determination. She had been rejected and humiliated and nearly destroyed by a man who believed his power made him untouchable. She had stood on a train platform with a ticket back to safety and every reason in the world to use it. But Elise Hartwell had never been good at taking the easy path. She had taken the chance a mountain man offered her on a frozen October platform, and she had turned it into an academy and a community and a marriage and a future worth believing in. The woman who almost left Blackstone became the woman who helped transform it into something worth staying for. And in doing so, she proved that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to board the train that carries you away from the life you are meant to live.